Nearly an entire family was wiped out one hot, muggy July 1991 night in St. Louis, Missouri. And it would take nearly 30 years for the truth about what happened that night to that family to finally come to the forefront. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of the Futo family murders. Viewer discretion is advised. At approximately 9 p.m. on July 25th, 1991, residences of a large apartment complex in St. Louis, Missouri, would hear a series of gunshots go off in the wooded area behind the complex, and this was near the New St. Marcus Cemetery. About 10 to 15 minutes later, those same residences who were kind of looking out their windows happened to see a young white male running from the woods and get into a little red Mitsubishi Eclipse. The car, he then drove it to the entrance of the apartment complex where other witnesses saw the man just sort of sitting in the car, apparently contemplating or something. And he did so for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then he took off again. It wouldn't be until the following day around 4:30 p.m. when people had gone into the woods because they were curious. They heard gunshots, but could have just been a bunch of stupid kids firing guns or fireworks. But people were curious to know if there was anything out there. And unfortunately, there was. They would find the body of a 24-year-old young man named Nick Futo. He had 4 gunshots in him, and he was lying face down flat on the ground. He had 1 gunshot through the back of his head, which appeared to be done execution style. He also had 2 gunshots into his back and 1 into the right side of his face. When police arrived and they were examining the crime scene, underneath the body they found several spent .38 caliber bullets. And then kind of close to the body, a weird thing, there was a brand new white pillow. Which investigators didn't really know what that was there for. In the dead man's shirt pocket, they found a folded up piece of paper, and all it had on there was 1408 American West, and this was obviously referring to a flight. Police would question people in the area, including the witnesses who heard the gunshots, who also saw the man fleeing in the red car. When this came out, other witnesses quickly came forward to say they saw that exact same red car parked near the Futo family home where Nick lived. And actually, that car, the red car, belonged to him. And this was around 10 or 10:30 or so at night. Well, by sheer chance, around the same time Nick's body was found, police were called to the Futo home by a couple of people to do a check on the family because both the wife and husband who lived there, neither of them showed up to work that day. And when family and friends and coworkers called the house, nobody answered. And this was all very unusual for them. So when police arrived, they approached the front door and began to knock on it when they noticed it was kind of very partially cracked open, and it kind of just opened when they knocked. So they called out for the residents to respond a few times, but no one did. So they very cautiously open the door all the way and walk in, and they kind of survey the living room area, and there was no forced entry anywhere. The door wasn't kicked in, no damage to the door or windows. From what they saw initially, there was no rummaging through the house. Nothing looked like it had been ransacked or stolen. And then they rounded a corner and went down a hallway, and that's when they noticed a body. It was the body of 50-year-old wife and mother Euna Futo. She was a mother of 3 adult boys. She was an accounting clerk at a nearby local bank. She had married Emory Futo back in 1964. And the 50-year-old husband and father, Imre Futo, well, he was found next in the house. He was in the basement. Imre was actually initially from Hungary, and he immigrated to the United States back in 1956. He would then marry Euna Futo in 1964, and they would go on to have 3 boys. And their boys were Emory, Nick, and Joe. Imre was described as a very no-nonsense kind of father. He was very strict. He would punish the kids a lot, but at the same time, he was also described as a really loving husband and father. So you kind of got 2 differing descriptions of him. So, in terms of the bodies, Euna appeared to have been severely beaten. There was like blood cast-off stains all up on the walls, over on the ceiling, so it looked like she had been beaten somewhere in that vicinity. Possibly she may have been dragged a few feet, it looks like, because there was like a small blood trail behind her. But that area was basically where she was killed. But there was no weapon near her body at all. The coroner would later determine that she had at least 5 severe injuries to her skull. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. In fact, parts of her skull bone had stuck inside of her brain. She also had some electrical cord tied around her neck. This is what police believed might have been used to help drag her down the hallway a little bit. And it may have been because if she had been out a little bit farther, anyone who walked in the house would have seen her kind of sticking out. So they think that person, whoever killed her, dragged her a little bit down the hall just to hide her a little bit. Imre was found at the bottom of the basement stairs. He had 4 very deep stab wounds and 3 gunshot wounds. They retrieved all of the bullets from his body, and they were also the same caliber that was used to shoot and kill their son, Nick Futo, a .38 caliber bullet. An hour and a half or so after they found Nick, Euna, and Imre, there was still one more body to be found. At approximately 6 p.m., police were notified about a car that was sort of about a block or 2 blocks away from the Futo home, and it looked like it had been kind of just dumped there. People saw that there were like a whole bunch of like trash bags kind of filling up the back seat, so people were concerned and they just called it in. When police arrived, they noticed there was blood in the car, so they went inside the vehicle, and underneath the trash bags was another body. It was determined to be that of 23-year-old Joe Futo. He had been shot 3 times, all with a .38 caliber weapon. One family now had 4 murdered family members, 3 of them shot and killed with the same gun, and 1 of them was beaten to death. The only family member not accounted for was 24-year-old Emory Futo, but he actually lived all the way in California. He specifically lived in the Riverside County area. On July 27, 1991, Nick Futo's red Mitsubishi was found abandoned in a Denny's parking lot. This was the same car seen by multiple witnesses on the night of the quadruple homicide. So, who on earth would have done this? Who would have taken out almost an entire family in one night? Well, police had their guy in mind. You see, according to witnesses, the person seen driving Nick's car, they couldn't confirm it, but that person looked a whole hell of a lot like Emory Futo. But again, he was in California, right? Well, later on July 27th, 1991, members of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department would go to the home of Emory just to ask him some questions. Emory said he was definitely not there. He said he hadn't been in St. Louis for well over a year, and he didn't even own a gun. But enough witnesses were able to say they saw Emory at some point in St. Louis the night of the murders. So the sheriff's deputies began pressing him for more information, and at that point he said, "No, I want a lawyer." Uh-oh. So they arrested him. They brought him to the local jail. The next day, members of the St. Louis Police Department had flown to Riverside County in order to talk to and question Emory. And he agreed to talk to him, in which point he then gave them 3 different stories about what happened that night. because he basically had to confirm that he was in St. Louis. He didn't explain why he lied. Story number 1. He said he flew to St. Louis to meet up with his brother Nick because Nick had arranged a $200,000 drug deal. So Nick had picked him up from the airport, hence the note in his pocket about what flight. He then, after that, they then drove to get a bite to eat, and then they went to the wooded area where Nick was eventually found dead. Emory said he stayed back in the car when suddenly he heard a whole bunch of gunshots going off, so he panicked, and then he just fled in the car. The problem with that is that there were witnesses who saw a man run from the woods who then got in the car, but Emory stating he was always in the car, so something was wrong about that story. He then said he went straight to the airport and flew back to California. Okay. 20 minutes later, he basically changes the story. He said, story number 2, he said that after he heard the gunshots, he then fled to his family's home. He walked inside the home and he found his dad and his mom had been murdered. So he freaked out, panicked, got into the car, went to the airport, went back home to California. Didn't say a thing to anyone, I guess. Then, I think like a day or so later, he came back with story number 3. And this is because police had said, you do understand that we may find your fingerprints and your possible DNA and other items in the house and on Nick's person. So are you really want to stick with these stories? He said, okay, here's the 3rd story. This one's the true one. He said Nick picked him up from the airport. They then went to go get a bite to eat. They then drove to the family's home, where it was Nick who murdered his parents. You see, Nick, that same night, and this is confirmed, he had purchased a mallet, and he had also purchased a white pillow. Apparently, he did this in order to, I guess, beat his parents to death. I'm not really sure what the pillow was for. Maybe to muffle the sounds of the gunshot. I don't know. But it was confirmed that Nick purchased those 2 items. So this particular story is kind of sounding a little more believable. So after Nick killed both of their parents, and apparently Emory just sort of sat back and let it happen, they then met up with their brother Joe. They then all got in the same car, they drove around a bit, they were talking. All of a sudden, Nick pulled out the gun and he shot his brother Joe and killed him. Then, again, according to Emory, the 2 of them, Nick and Emory, went to the woods, where apparently Nick and him had agreed to some sort of suicide pact. So Emory says he then shot his brother, Nick, in the back of the head, and apparently 3 more times for some reason. And then he chickened out on his part of doing it, of shooting himself. He couldn't go through with it. So then he fled back home to California. Over the course of the next little time frame before his trial, he would change details about story number 3, kind of here and there, like little things. It just kept evolving into something different. At any rate, he would be charged with 4 counts of murder, and he was tried in St. Louis, of course, where a jury would find him guilty. They convicted him, and he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms. The physical evidence about his guilt was clear as day. He flew to St. Louis on July 25th, 1991, but police would find out he used a fake name and used cash to pay for the ticket. On July 19th, 1991, Emory had mailed a small box to his brother Nick in St. Louis. It was like 3 or 4 pounds. It would turn out that in that box was the .38 caliber weapon, the gun that he used to eventually kill Nick with and other family members. Police then interviewed friends in California, where they confirmed that a friend of Emory's agreed to drive him to the airport on July 25th, and then that same friend picked him up from the airport in California on the next day, July 26th. They also confirmed through a cab driver that it was Emory who paid for a cab to pick him up from the Denny's parking lot, the same Denny's parking lot where Nick's abandoned vehicle was found. But police, lawyers, were all just sort of like bogged down by Why did he do it? What was the motive? I mean, they know he killed all 4 family members. None of his stories were true, but why? Why did he do this? Because there was no actual obvious motive here. Well, that answer would come 30 years later, in December of 2021. Like I said, he was convicted and sentenced to 4 life terms, so he's in prison for the rest of his life. He has no possibility of ever getting out. So when he was 60 years old, he said, you know what? I'm getting old, and I'm never getting out of here, so I might as well come clean about what happened that night. So he reached out to a reporter, and the very first thing he said to this reporter was, quote, let me read, "I did this. Nobody else did anything. I am responsible for everybody. I'm nearing 60 years old, and the truth needs to be told, finally." So what was the truth? Well, the first truth was that his brother, Nick, was actually not his full-blood brother. He was his half-brother, because Nick's father was their uncle. Multiple family members would later confirm this is true. Once all 3 of the boys, Emory, Nick, and Joe, were about 5 or 6 years old, in that range, that is when the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse began. Allegedly, there was physical abuse from both of them, mental and emotional abuse from both parents. The sexual abuse came from the father. Emory said, his dad would come in the middle of the night and sexually abuse him or one of his brothers. One story he gave is that he had to force his father off of one of his brothers. And when he did so, his father would then turn it to Emory and had his way with him. By the time Emory was 8 years old, he started sleeping with a knife under his pillow so that he could stab his father when he came in and tried to sexually abuse him again. Well, one night, his father crept in the room and climbed on top of his 8-year-old son, and Emory reached under his pillow, and he went to go grab the knife. His father looked at him and smiled and said, "You're not going to find it." And then he sexually molested him. When he was 15, Emory finally laid a solid punch on his dad and knocked him on his ass. And then that's when his dad got up and punched him back. He then ran into the house, grabbed a shotgun, and fired it towards Emory's direction, but he missed. Their father had put Emory in the hospital at least 4 times. And the other 2 boys had been hospitalized at least once or twice because of him. Which, of course, every time the boys had to make up excuses and lie about what had happened, to get them in the hospital. I fell off a bike, or, oops, I fell down the stairs. They'd have to lie for their abusive father. Eventually, when Emory got older, he would leave home. He would join the Navy. But he would get messages from his 2 brothers who were still at home that the sexual abuse wasn't over. It kept going, and their father was going at both of them more now because Emory was gone. The dad was even beating their mother from time to time, like beating her to a pulp. Emory would come home on a couple of occasions, and every time he did, there would be huge fights that would break out. A couple of times, Emory grabbed his father by the throat and pinned him against the wall. One of these times, the father looked at him and said, "It was your mother, right?" And Emory's like, "What do you mean?" He said, "It was your mother who took the knife away from your pillow. She did it because I told her to do it, and she let me abuse you. She let me go into your rooms and sexually abuse you." By the way, this has all been confirmed by family members. There was even a cousin of theirs, her name was Betty, who confirmed that even she was sexually abused by this man. So it wasn't just his own children, it was other kids too. One of the family members looked at the father and said, "One day these kids are going to grow up and murder you, right? They're going to kill you. To which he just said, I know, and laughed it off. Emory would go on to marry a wonderful woman named Angela. They had a baby. The baby's name was Joshua. One day, Emory let his parents come and visit them at the house. This is 2,000 miles away at this point. That's how far away they lived. When Emory walked into baby Joshua's room one night, he saw his father and his mother alone with Joshua. And he said, they were doing things to my son, to my baby, that I will never discuss out loud. He would say that he failed to protect his own son, even from 2,000 miles away from where his abuse had happened. That is when Emory said, you touch my kid, and that's it. So he had a conversation with his two brothers. Emory, Nick, and Joe got together, and they said, that's it. This is done. We need to kill him. And they actually set a plan, the three of them, in motion to murder their parents. This is why Emory mailed the gun to Nick, because Nick knew it was coming. This is why Nick was confirmed, it was Nick, who made the purchase of the mallet that would likely eventually go on to be the murder weapon against his mother, and also the pillow that was likely supposed to be used but wasn't. When Emory finally arrived on July 25th, 1991 in St. Louis, the two brothers, in particular Joe, were suddenly they were very hesitant. They were very sketchy about this whole plan. Joe said, I can't do this. I can't do this. He got very emotional about it. He said, well, I can't fucking kill them. I can't be part of this. So Nick had gone away for a little bit to go purchase the mallet and the pillow. And so it was just Joe and Emory alone in Joe's car. A fight broke out between the two of them, a huge argument. It got really, really heated. And that is when Emory, who just had the gun, he just he instinctively just pulled the gun up and shot his brother. He just did it instinctively. He shot him 3 times, and then he hid his brother's body in the back of his car and put a bunch of trash bags over him. He then met up with Nick. And then Nick suddenly, he was now very hesitant. He was very back and forth, oh my God, I can't do this. I can't do this. These are our parents. We can't murder our own parents. Emory managed to convince Nick to go to that section of woods, probably just to calm down and have a conversation. But Emory was doing it with a malicious purpose. He knew at that point that since Nick was trying to back out of this plan, Nick was no longer an accomplice. He was now a witness. Especially once they found that if they would find the body of Joe, Nick would know what happened. So Emory, while in the woods, took the gun and shot his brother in the back of the head, unsuspecting. And then he shot him a few more times. He claims that right then and there he wanted to end his own life, but he knew he had to at least take care of his father first. So that is when he was seen fleeing the woods and getting into Nick's car. He then entered the family house, and his mother and father both worked very late nights, really, really late. So no one was home. So he would hide in the house, and his mother got home first. And according to him, there was no conversation. There was nothing. He just suddenly came up behind her, startled her. She reacted for a split second when he then beat her over the head with the mallet 4 or 5 times. He then, half of her body was sort of hanging out of the hallway that could have been visible from the front door, so he wrapped the electrical cord around his mother's neck, and then he dragged her a little bit more down the hallway to hide her. A few hours later, his father got off work around 12:30 in the morning, and then he walked into the house where Emory was still hiding, and he hadn't noticed his wife's body, so Emory just sort of comes out casually holding a gun in his hand. His dad just looked at him. They looked at each other, he said, for just what felt like forever, before his dad finally said, quote, I knew this day was coming. I just hoped that it wouldn't. Emory then fired 3 shots into his father, which caused him to fall down the stairs in the basement, where his father was still alive. And then he took the knife, and he said he slowly stuck it into his father deeply about 4 times. His dad basically suffered, and then he eventually died. And then from there, the rest is history. Yeah. So, like I said earlier, several family members, they had confirmed that this abuse did happen. And if you're wondering, like, well, why didn't anyone say anything? And why doesn't anyone ever say anything? There's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of emotional reasons, a lot of reasons that they're terrified to say anything. There's a lot of reasons why people don't talk about the abuse they go through. There's a lot of reasons why people cover for their abusers. It's not an easy situation to be like, yep, he's abusing me, and then that's it. It's terrifying for these people. So that's why things were never said. Even family members who weren't experiencing the abuse were terrified that if they said something, that would cause a reaction that would get the kids hurt or killed, or maybe themselves hurt or killed. So Imre, the father, he was a monster. He was a piece of shit. He deserved to spend the rest of his days locked behind a dark, damp prison cell. But he was murdered. This is very similar, I guess you can say, very, very similar to the Menendez brothers story. A lot of people ask me, like, do you feel they should be in prison? My answer is yes. What the father did to these 3 boys and what the parents did to the Menendez brothers are awful, horrendous things, illegal things. But reacting, a decade or so later and killing them is more of a methodical, planned out thing. Like, I planned to kill them. Whereas if they had killed him in the middle of like an abusive moment, perhaps this would be a different story. But murder is still murder. Just like sexually abusing people is against the law, so is murder. So you should have to pay for that. Here's my thing about this particular story. If Emory had just killed the dad, and there are plenty of witnesses to back up the abuse, all of that. And then if he had, told in court during his trial about, and his wife could confirm about the abuse that might have happened to their baby Joshua that one night when his parents visited, one could argue that there was some sort of justification to what he did. He should still go to prison because he still murdered his father, but maybe he would have gotten off with a significantly lighter sentence. But the fact of the matter is he planned this methodically. Not only did he kill his dad, but he also killed his mom, who one could argue back and forth all day about how you handle that situation. Whether or not the mom is truly guilty of anything, or if she was just as much of a victim as everyone else. And that's why she let him do the things he did, because she had no other choice. So did she deserve that brutal murder? No. Sorry. Maybe she deserved to get locked away too. I don't know. But we don't know the whole story now. We don't know her side of the story. But then he killed his 2 brothers. And he killed his 2 brothers just in cold blood. He is a reactionary thing when he killed Joe, and then he methodically killed his brother Nick because he didn't want to get caught. His 2 brothers that were also victims to this monster. So when it's all said and done, he got the sentence he deserved because he murdered 4 people. At the very least, he murdered 2 extremely innocent people who did absolutely nothing wrong. But this is one of those stories where you can argue back and forth all day long. Just like with the Menendez brothers, there's going to be 2 very, very differing opinions on what's deserved and what isn't deserved. Like I said, I personally think murder is murder. You take a life, you go to prison. If you take a life deliberately, if it's not in legitimate self-defense. Like I said, if he had stabbed his dad, like in the middle of him being abused, different story. But he didn't do that. I don't know. What do you guys think? This one's, it's a tough one. It really is. In the end, though, he deserves to be in prison because he still killed at least 2 very innocent people, like I said. So he's where he should be. But that is it for this case. It's a wild one. Hope you found it interesting. If you want to see shorter form cases, I am posting shorter videos on here now every day that I don't post a long video. But I have well over 2,000 cases over on my TikTok page, which I'm not really using anymore. It's basically dormant, but until they banish it forever, there are so many videos over there you can watch if you want to follow me and watch all those videos, a whole bunch of crime videos. So Making a True Crimer is the name. It's also in the description below. If you have a case you want me to cover, please send me an email to mikey@truecrimerer.com. Which is also in the description below. Please go to my link tree, also below, and check out my crimerer case list first. Scroll through it, look for the name you want, search for the name. If you don't see it, then email me. If you do see the name on the list, please don't email me. I get inundated with duplicates all the time, and it drives me bonkers. I cover the cases at random, so I could cover it the next video or 6 years from now. I don't know. So it could be a while. So please be patient with it. Lastly, if you want to support me in any way, we do sell merch. Also in the link tree below, we sell t-shirts and hoodies and mugs and wine glasses. We sell for the next month and a half or so, we're selling a Christmas ornament. That was a big seller last year. So to hang from your Christmas tree. So you could do that if you like. We do ship internationally. He will ship it anywhere you live, and he will send it. All right, so that is it for this video. And until the next one, True Crimeroonies. What if I drank like that, bros? Well, that's not a way to end a video, but anyway, here. So here's my real ending. Okay, so here we go.